Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve, presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. We are sometimes asked, why the name the Confederal Reserve? In choosing to name our country's third central bank in 1913, the private non-governmental founders of the Federal Reserve chose a name that sounded authoritative and distinguished. While the Confederal Reserve as a podcast does not seek to upset the debt markets of the nations or jeopardize the earned wealth of all families on the planet, the podcast does rely on the authority of friendship and goodwill of the host and the guest. It remains distinguished by the reserved vintage treasures that each guest offers amid our fruitful discussion. Before we get going, I invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel, and click on the icon to receive notifications so that you may remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. Now then, the structure of the show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for the episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Dr. Matthew Ramage, professor of theology at Benedictine College. His research and writing concentrates especially on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, the wedding of ancient and modern methods of biblical interpretation, the dialogue between faith and science, and stewardship of creation. It's my great pleasure to welcome our first guest on the Confederal Reserve, Dr. Matthew Ramage.
Honor to be
Hello,
with
Matthew.
you, Jason. Great to talk to you, my friend.
Very good. Yes, no, it's great to have you here on our first episode. So we'll begin with our first question. Again, our gimmick we want you to mimic, sort of this idea of sort of a conversation between friends about kind of things that matter to us, and particularly our classical works. So first question to kick things off, could you introduce your book today? Or actually, could you just let me know, and then we'll get going there.
Yeah, it was a great topic, and it was tough to think about which one I wanted to choose, but it's hard to get more classical than the book of Genesis, about the origins of our universe and the nature of mankind, our relationship with God. It's foundational to so many things about our lives. It branches into every seeming topic, whether it's related to the way we live, faith. You mentioned my interaction of faith and science. So it touches everything, and that's what I want to talk about.
Great. So is there a particular kind of portion of the book or aspect that we want to focus on more concretely? Because it's 50 chapters, right? So the first book of the Bible, and there's a lot that goes on. It's sort of there's sort of kind of this mythological part of the beginning, the creation story is the story of the fall, but then kind of the melodrama of Abraham and his family. It reads sort of like a telenovela a little bit.
Yep, got right up there
in the middle there. Yes, right at the top. We're going to start right at the top.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
right. So you have the Abraham and Isaac. I have the Caravaggio painting up here, that drama, right?
Yes.
And one of my favorite works of art by one of my favorite artists, and that's more toward the middle of the book, chapter 22. But I think probably focusing on the first few chapters mainly, even the first 11, where scholars often call it primeval history, where you have basically events at the dawn of civilization, or at least ostensibly at the beginning. And for that reason, it's in this mythological flair that is relatable to all people of all time. Once you get into chapter 12, you're with Abraham's story, and you start to enter more of what we consider generally history in the more modern sense of the term. But yes, the first 11 chapters, just for the audience to get the overview, for those of us for whom it's been a while since we read the Bible,
Sure.
You begin in the first two chapters with the creation account. And actually, there are two accounts. So the first chapter, we have the famous words, let us create man in our image, right? And then you have male and female, he created them together, their divine image. And man is created on the sixth day of creation. God rests on the seventh day. And then there's a second creation account, actually, which, as we've discussed years ago, I'm sure it's fascinating because the second account, it goes in the opposite order. And the first
How
one,
so?
man is the apex of creation, and the second account, now he gets a name, Adam. He's created first, and then all the creatures are created, and then finally we get Eve. And so those are your first two chapters, and we can always delve into that. There's a lot in there about what Adam means, his relationship to his wife, and etc. And then chapter 3 is the
Yeah.
fall.
Well, before we get to the fall, because I always think of the Genesis as sort of like, things fall apart, and we mess things up by the third chapter, right? And wow,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be a long book, folks. Just
Yeah.
buckle in. Uh, but you talked about kind of those maybe inverse orders, or right, the order of creation in chapter 1, and then the order of creation in chapter 2. What kind of insights, or what do you sense is going on there? Because I think order, when I think of Genesis in the beginning of Genesis, like that's the idea, right? Genesis 1, of the 7 days of creation, it's all about order, right? That God's in
Yes.
charge. That there's this sort of
Yes.
chaos in the beginning, the waters, right, and sort of right the spirit, the breath of the Lord over the waters, it becomes a force of order, right? Not like
Yes.
force and sort of struggle and sort of Hegelian kind of sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
but but
Yeah.
but sort of the authority, right, of the actor, the one kind of putting into being, into existence, all that is. So if you want to,
Preci-
what do you gather from all of that?
yeah, precisely. In fact, yeah, you mentioned not in the Hegelian sense and also not in the ancient Mesopotamian sense, because the imagery of Genesis, first several chapters, is actually in earlier myths that we see in Mesopotamia, uh, the Enuma Elish, Gilgamesh works that even on the latest datings of Genesis back to Moses are older still, in which we're from the culture that Abraham came from.
I always see of like Gilgamesh and kind of the Babylonian creation narratives, sort of like the WWF,
Yeah.
before it was the WWE, like before like
Yes.
the panda of the World Wildlife Foundation, or
Yeah.
destroyed the WWF and made it WWE. But it has a sort of like, kind of like the heel Tiamat or whatever, and then Marduk, and
Yeah.
and kind of this struggle that we don't see in Genesis. So it these things always sort of trigger in my mind. No. This is something very human in us. Like we see struggle in the chaos of our fallen world, right? And we kind of project that onto creation and the nature of things as they always were. But that's not what we see in Genesis. So I'll let you continue.
Yeah, well, first of all, on WWF, I'm so out of the loop. I'm still back in the 1980s Nintendo game where it's WWF. You got Hulk Hogan. Anyway,
Oh yeah, no, good
but
times.
yeah, that's a great image. I need to steal that when I teach this next time, because it's a theomachy. It's a war between the gods that you see in a lot
Mm.
of myths. And so, yeah, to pick up where you left off there in the Mesopotamian story, of which there are a few different variations, Marduk, the high god, basically the way he becomes the high god is Tiamat, the sea dragon goddess, is causing all this havoc, right? And then the gods find out, well, who's going to help us to put the order? And then Marduk says, well, I'll do it if you make me the high god. And he slays her and he creates the world by dividing the waters of her body into two, and he puts one up above and puts one
He
below.
jumps from the high rope, and then yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Body slam. Yeah. And then, like, the thing you can't do on TV is then you split the carcass open.
Yeah, that's they didn't have the special effects back in the
Although there was a
80s and
guy, I think it
90s.
was the Amazonian or something like that. Do you remember that from Nintendo? There was a guy in the game, he would like eat your head.
Oh wow.
So I need to go back and revisit that. It's been
Yeah,
30 years. So
yeah. When we find the time, we'll go back and revisit.
yeah.
Wait a second. Was there something with the ancient Mesopotamian? No, maybe not. Okay.
Yeah.
but
But
but that is I think maybe the human cycle, right? Like where we it's sort of Augustine's critique of the Greek and Roman gods, right? They're sort of projection of the disordered desires of man, and so then you make them gods. So if Zeus is kind of a womanizer and just kind of out and about and spreading his divine seed everywhere, well then me as a man can do that, right? It kind of gives justification if we project these great acts of the gods that are violent, that are kind of contrary to reason and to more caught up in a struggle than me as a man in my struggles, well then
Yeah.
I have license to do whatever works, right? Sort of a might makes right kind of argument.
Yeah. And so you can see how Genesis is very subtle to us, but in the culture of that time would have been massively scandalous, if you will. It would have been truly a revolution. I like what Ratzinger says, monotheism came about through revolution. It's not the natural way we think. We have the universe inhabited by all these different gods and spirits at war with each other and at war with us, and we better sacrifice to placate them. And so one of the beauties of Genesis is God just speaks. To go back to what you were saying earlier,
Mm.
it's the establishing order through the logos, the word, the davar in Hebrew, and that is very subtle, but it's different from all the surrounding accounts. And my students and I were actually reading Leon Kass yesterday. He's an interesting Jewish author, and he was pointing out, just as the law of Leviticus, the third book of the Bible, has all these divisions you're supposed to make: kosher, non-kosher, Jew, Gentile, that the division is inherent already in creation. God wants to separate the waters, separate the light and darkness. That's a way of ordering for the Jews, and it's a way of quasi sacramentally instilling in the Jewish people the conviction that you ought to separate yourself, to be holy, kadosh, to be set apart from the ways of the world.
Uh, Let me. I think I can connect this idea and something you brought up before, though. You mentioned that Ratzinger was talking about how monotheism is the word used was revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But we do kind of see monotheism in the natural philosophers of, say, like the Greeks, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but the thing I always find with, say, Aristotle's understanding and like the physics is that this God, this sort of this one that kind of it's in Aristotle in the physics, it's in Plato in the in this sort of uh, kind of what becomes sort of Platonism and this idea of the one.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find in sort of the God of the philosophers is sort of a God that doesn't really have need to care for us, right? And in a certain sense, we're sort of a drag on that God.
Yeah.
I the kind of distinct from, say, of creation myth or story or kind of narrative that can be kind of communicated to humans and then passed down across generations, across technological advancements. Like the story still makes sense to us
Yeah.
as it made sense to people thousands of years ago. But the God of the Greeks is it's not a creation story. It's sort of like an emanation account,
Mm-hmm.
right? I give the example of sort of it's for the God of Aristotle, we're sort of kind of like dandruff, like like nobody intentionally like wakes up in the morning and just, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cause a bunch of dandruff today, right? It's like
Yeah.
no, it's just something that kind of happens, sort of like flakes off of you and your greatness. Um,
Yeah.
and for the Greeks, so it's sort of because in that understanding we emanate from God opposed to being actively created. Let there be, Matthew Ramage. Let there be Jason Fujikawa. Um, it's there's no kind of invitation to participate in that division.
Yes.
Whereas in Genesis we see God creating it, and but then kind of commanding, right, the work in the garden, commanding, being fruitful and multiplying, and participating in the divisio, right, or the divisions, the
Yes.
ordering that He has initiated.
You know, I took that comment from Ratzinger's book, Truth and Tolerance, on Christianity and Other Religions. I assign it in my class on the church and world religions at college. And it's fascinating how it connects with what you're saying. There's a section in that book also where Ratzinger distinguishes religion from faith. Religio, as our classicist here could tell the audience better than but it binds you together, it binds
Mm.
back. And like Aquinas will say, anybody can have religio. It can be a natural virtue, subset of justice, but faith has to be a specific kind of religio that is relationship.
Hmm.
And you don't pray to the unmoved mover. So there's that. The Bible brings that. It's different from the Greeks, and then it brings the ordering principle that you would tend to associate more with the Greeks. That's not typically in myths that are more chaotic. It brings what Plato calls for, I think it's in the Republic, for true theologia, true speech about God.
Yeah, no, that is right. This idea that I think sometimes I can fall into this idea of like faith is something that I'm trying to get, right. I have this sort of like hungry hippo kind of feeling about like
Mm-hmm.
there's some sort of thing that I want to know kind of the truth about creation and the world, the truth about God, and sometimes it becomes easy to sort of just forget that all of that searching is really preceded by God revealing Himself to us, right? So
Yes.
so Genesis, back to Genesis, right? It is a revelation that this happened, because as we can see from the accounts, there's always this question with Genesis of sort of, okay, you can have like a point of view sort of situation, particularly here in these first couple chapters, because these are recounting things that happened before humans were there to observe them,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of the rest of the Bible is largely after humans are created, and therefore okay, well, that makes sense that somebody recounted this, right? Insofar as there are things in the past, and then at the end in the book of Revelation, there's things yet to come, and so
Yep.
this sort of this need, or this kind of the inspiration of the revelation becomes a little bit more clear to us. But there's a sense that these things that are happening are then given, revealed to the sort of this author of Genesis, right? And maybe we could spend some time kind of talking about that, this authorship of Genesis
Yeah.
as well, because it seems to be a I was surprised. I think the way that the Catholic world has had to kind of grapple with the
Yeah.
authorship of Genesis in the last 100 years
Yeah.
has been kind of a fruitful insight, and something that Joseph Ratzinger, was involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. It does remain a debate in Catholic circles about the authorship. And Ratzinger was such a helpful figure. It's one of the reasons I constantly go back to him in my scholarship. As much of a Thomist as I am, a
He
scholar of
he
Aquinas,
kind of just fell off the face of the earth in like 2005, though. It's like mid-April, and all of a sudden, like, where did he go? What
yeah,
where the
yeah, that's right.
this
Wait, now there's this Benedict guy.
he's got just a great career at the the
Yeah.
CDF, and all of a sudden, poof, no,
You know what's
we don't hear about this
fascinating?
guy anymore.
I've been tracing, since the time he was a professor and his unpublished lecture notes through his time at Vatican II and as a bishop. And he admittedly did, as he said, have to tone it down and not get too speculative, because he had the responsibility for the church. He's supposed to teach what we already know for certain.
Right.
But it's fun to see the themes he continued up until the last year and months of his catecheses on Wednesdays. He
Ah.
was talking about these same themes that we're bringing up here today. And so it's really beautiful that I think a lot of people don't notice it, but he was both a traditional guy, but also a renewer, right? And always
Right.
updating the understanding of the faith.
Yeah, no, he really one of those words in sort of his understanding of the Second Vatican Council, right, is this idea of continuity, right?
Yeah.
That and this sort of this Noved Vetera idea of just taking what is good from what is old, and the traditional understanding, say, of the authorship of Genesis, of an or not sorry, a Mosaic, right? Moses being
Yeah.
the author of the first 5 books, right? But then kind of confronting those problems of like, okay, so then um, he kind of dies in was in Deuteronomy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and, and we don't know where he's buried, but like, how could he write that? Granted, it's revelation, and so you could
Yeah.
write things that have yet to come because it's revealed. Yet at the same time, maybe potentially there could have been other human authors that kind of participated in that inspiration. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about how kind of
Yeah.
where the Catholic world, the church kind of stands on the authorship, and whether there's wiggle room at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the early 1900s, when the magisterium was very negative on any other authors besides Moses, it allowed that he didn't write his own death scene. So that's nice. But yeah, Ratzinger actually tells the story on the 100th anniversary of the Pontifical Biblical Commission that wrote those documents. And he's the president of it, writing this. And he
Right.
said, look, the magisterium at the time, despite the continuity we have, there are times when it overextended its reach and it damaged its own credibility, because nowadays the vast majority of scholars, if I had to put a number on it, it's easily over 95%, think that the Pentateuch is a compilation. And so, like in the circles I run in, it's maybe less common. People really want to hold that Moses wrote the whole thing. But one neat thing about Ratzinger is he says it's actually an incidental. It doesn't pertain to the substance of faith who wrote it, but it's nevertheless telling and interesting. Like Aquinas brings up on Job, it's not essential, but it might be informative to know when it was written and who wrote it. So yeah, it's pretty clear that I think we probably both picked up in grad school, if not before, that there's several reasons you can tell Moses didn't write the whole thing. Its geographical point of view is from the time they've crossed into the Holy Land, because it'll talk about on the other side of the Jordan, but they didn't cross the Jordan River until after Moses was dead. So that part can't have been written by Moses. And then you have
the
yeah,
Hysteron Proteron of the Pentateuch, right? Like the Hysteron Proteron is like the last first, sort of like
yeah,
the famous one that always comes to my mind is sort of where they exit the Trojan horse and unlatch the door, right? That's
yeah,
kind of how it shows up in Virgil. You're like,
nice.
I think they had to do the last thing first, right? Anyway, okay.
Yeah, yeah. No,
It
that's
kind of
right.
gives a historical, like it kind of signifies that we all know this thing was going to happen, and therefore we will kind of talk in this weird kind of historical present, but
Yeah,
understandable.
yeah. No, I got to leave it to Jason to bring in the Virgil. I appreciate that.
It there are
Yeah,
certain works, right? I mean, this is sort of the premise of this interview, or the Confederal Reserve is, right. These works that kind of anchor us, right? That become kind of feeding into our worldview, and how we process the world around us. That is sort of special, right? That um, isn't going to produce the same result in every person. That we will have, ideas and thoughts that come to our mind that
yes.
kind of we see through these lens, and if we're kind of social science researchers, we'll call them our biases, right?
Mm,
uh, but I always like the word bias always has this, the Greek or ba, right? This sort of like idea of force or power.
yeah,
But I always kind of think in sort of the humility of the human knower, that it is more of sort of this passive sort of lens and ability to kind of like receive, right, in the mode of the knower,
yeah,
uh, the the ideas that come to us, and then it's a handful of books, a handful of works or ideas or thoughts or insights that everybody has, that kind of shape how we engage the world around us and the life that we have to live. And so being able to kind of meet with you today is allowing us to kind of have this sort of
yes,
mutual appreciation of what we see in Genesis. The first, first we've talked about maybe the first chapter. We can kind of move into chapters 2 and 3, but it kind of, we both see it. We're not disputing the kind of the truth of what the text is, but at the same time they kind of hit us differently. and
yes,
and that's kind of the beauty of having conversations with good friends, the beauty of seeking to kind of look at a classical work, and one way kind of define a classic, not sort of the Mark Twain sense of like it's what a book often referred to and never read, but but a book that admits of more than one reading. I was kind of impressed upon my students, when we read something like these works, these classical works of the Bible, right? You can say maybe this is my first reading or this is my fifth reading of Genesis,
yeah,
but not my definitive reading, right? We're
right,
not vampires, kind of like sucking the blood out of a work, right? Get to the marrow,
yeah,
right? We want to get it
yeah,
all. No, this is your first reading. I hope you will have many others, but
yes,
and each one will take you deeper. Each one will hit you differently, and so that's kind of the mark of a classic, and that's why it's just so much fun to discuss this with you today. But maybe if you want to move into Genesis 2, insights there,
Yeah.
or the scintillating Genesis chapter 3.
Yes, or as a bridge between those, I was thinking about Augustine on
Ah,
Christian teaching and how he'll say if your interpretation's in accord with charity, multiple interpretations are possible. And then the saying that's attributed to Augustine and John the 23rd says it's attributed to him. Maybe I've never been able to verify this, but it's an ancient saying. In essentials, we should have unity. In non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity, in its various iterations. And I love that. It's the message I try to leave people, because people get very sometimes distraught if they don't have the certain interpretation, or science comes along and challenges their interpretation, or if maybe Moses didn't write the whole thing. And so I think that's a very important principle. Just like Augustine,
mhm.
one more thing from him on Genesis 1 we ought to mention is how he takes those days highly symbolically, right? And so the Catechism says these chapters, really the first 11 chapters of Genesis, are real events in figurative, i.e., symbolic language. And so that there's a generosity of interpretation there that, look, we run up against the facts today of the universe is at least 13.7 billion years old. It's not 6,000 years if you take the genealogies of Genesis 1 through 11 literally. But that Augustine, I think, was perfectly fine with that, and sees it in its symbolism really just as relevant to us today. So that actually is a good transition to Genesis 2, because that's where we get Adam.
Hmm.
And Adam is just a terrific play on words in Hebrew. He's called Adam in Genesis 2:7 because he's taken from the Adamah. He's taken from the ground or dirt or arable soil. And so it's a
Yeah.
symbolic teaching about what is the first man, what's his nature, and it means human being. So he's also every man.
So I have this theory about Genesis, that it is a 50 chapters, expressing one important question that, kind of in showing sort of the consequences of how one answers that. But Genesis is really a book about the question, "Who's your daddy?" Because it really has this sense of, and I have, in the Better Pairs podcast, there's a whole episode on Genesis, and this idea of GNU and the knees, and receiving the child on the knees, and that's what the father
Oh,
does, because biologically we know who the mother is at every birth of a human, but we don't
yeah,
know who the father is, and so this sort of claimed paternity, and it kind of feeds into Genesis 2 and particularly Genesis 3, in the sense of knowing who your father is, knowing that God the Father, right, is there to protect Adam and Eve in the garden. She's not Eve yet, right? She gets Eve at the end of
yeah,
chapter 3. Uh, but to understand the care and concern for the ordering for man in his creation. But the reason I bring it up here with Adam is because the book is largely a question of who's your daddy. It is also littered with dad jokes.
yeah.
And so there's sort of the pun, the play on words, is of a piece, right? Because and my theory about dad jokes is that pretty much that's how dads remember things, right? There's so
Yes,
much going on
this is
that we kind
good.
of that we kind of
Yeah,
connect ideas through the puns, and so if as an oral history, right, being able to kind of relate these realities, these sort of sublime truths through stories,
yeah.
that those kind of connections are to be expected.
I am going to steal that one too. The dad jokes, because in scholarly terms, a lot of those are referenced under the banner of etiologies. You're getting to the
Uh,
hatia, the cause, right? The kind of history behind the idea of, oh, he's called Adam because he's taken from the Adamah, and she's called woman Isha because she's taken from the man. Well, in English, it doesn't make much sense. Well, she's taken from her Ish. Actually, it kind of does. It's funny that despite how distantly related English and uh, Hebrew really are. I mean, they're fundamentally Indo-European languages, and so woe, man, man, and then you have in English, even for Adam and Adamah, you could say he's called a human because he's taken from the hummus.
mhm.
So yeah, but there's a fatherly relationship there that Yeah, you don't see that in the Mesopotamian stories. We're created to be slaves, and those
Well,
stories.
well, there's always this is a certain hostility between fathers and sons, right? And it kind of it weaves its way. Recently, in one of the Better Pairs podcasts, I was talking about sort of Kronos or Saturn, right, and Zeus, Jupiter, Pater Zeus, Jupiter,
Yes.
uh, and how like he wants to eat his children, right?
Yeah.
Like, I no,
Yeah.
but there's sort of a hostility, right? And we almost the what Freud would talk about as the Oedipal complex, right? Um,
Hmm.
but this sort of the anger that uh, right, Oedipus in the story, right? He just runs into his biological father on the road and doesn't know he's the king or whatever, but is so like they at such odds with each other. He kills a stranger. Turns out it was his father who also tried to kill him as an infant, and there's always a sort of strife or violence between that father son, father child relationship that we see in other cultures in the ancient world that is perhaps right that projection of our fallenness onto
Hmm.
our parents, right? And so
Yes.
that parental bond is broken, is fragile, right? And so seen in Genesis before the fall, the appropriate way, right, the proper ordering, I think is very instructive, normative, right, opposed to the
Yes.
norm just being broken families.
Yeah. Yeah. I attempted to get this across to a class. We're reading God's two books, Scripture and Creation, with the Inklings, and
Uh,
did some Chesterton, Tolkien, Lewis. I know Chesterton's pre-Inkling, but he had an influence upon those guys. And then we just got done reading some Greek and Norse myths, and I think the students had a hard time knowing what to do with it because they're not used to seeing God portrayed that way. And the point from my perspective was to show the newness and freshness of what the Bible's actually doing that we take for granted.
no, that is. I'm just going in my mind. Oh yes, no, I could see how there's a certain sort of, I don't know, appropriate, I don't know if it's jealousy or envy, excitement that you have students who are so kind of sheltered in their understanding of 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 what God is,
Yeah.
that is a shock to them, opposed to right in the kind of the historical progression where no, like we have all the pagan stuff going on here, and then the Judeo-Christian God is different, right?
Yes.
And so, granted, um, I think probably in the ancient world, the movement right between um, popular entertainment and just sort of like the narratives that influence the world having a divine element to them was much more kind of organic, whereas I think in the modern world we compartmentalize.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a God thing, and it's over here.
Yeah.
This is the thing where I think about for an hour on a Sunday, and
Yep.
then the rest of my week, all 167 hours, is over in this other stuff, which I say is my realism, and then there's my idealism for an hour on Sunday, and we kind of
Yeah.
compartmentalize those two ideas. Um, I would want to say seamlessly, but then I think the cracks show up in
Yeah.
our lives where we have this sort of this compartmentalization that doesn't always make sense, and
If I
and
may
so
pick up on
yeah,
that.
go for it.
Okay, so this is a major theme I've been working on the past few years and working on both academically and working on in my life. And it actually relates to the word work in Hebrew. So Adam is put in the garden to till and keep it, to avad and to shamar it. And just some of the great things about learning Hebrew, or if you don't know Hebrew, the audience, you guys, there's plenty of good resources out there that are quite legible that go into this stuff. But avad and shamar are used in Leviticus for the duties of priests,
Hmm.
to guard and keep the temple, to work in the law. So I think about, well, he's tilling and keeping. Well, another synonym for to till is to work the soil, with your hands, like I was doing the other day, and then I dropped a paver on it, and the curse of the fall became apparent when some four-letter words came out of my mouth. But yeah, it was used for a priestly activity, And so the Jews saw Adam actually as a priest before there was an official law. And Adam represents all of us. So we are all priests of creation. For Catholics, of course, there's the sacramental priesthood, which is distinct from this. But
Right, right.
Vatican II says we're called to offer the world to God. So our entire life is supposed to be offering everything. And what made me think of this, Jason, was it's not just that hour a week. Eden is the cosmos as well. It's the primeval state of harmony with God. And so we are supposed to exercise or tap into that Eden through through grace living in the garden of the world. And therefore, someone who's doing a podcast or working at a factory or a lawyer, even lawyers, can find grace in that time. And of course, it's special when you're out in the physical cosmos as well. I love gardening, but I think that's really important when you understand Adam archetypally as the representative of all mankind and Eden as creation. It really becomes apparent that we have this vocation to consecrate the world to God.
Yes, no, and I like the idea of order, right? And not just because I emotionally like the idea of order. Like I actually emotionally kind of sometimes a little bit frustrated by order. the I think one of the ideas with Better Pairs and kind of dealing with ideas is that I've come to realize that um, even though in my kind of educational background is sort of steeped in Thomism
Mm-hmm.
and you think about St. Thomas Aquinas and how he orders kind of the whole universe and this exitus redditus paradigm of the Summa Theologiae, that our world can't really receive Thomas, right? That the saint is the antidote for his age, and that we are kind of falling into more of a patristic moment,
Mm-hmm.
where the truth of the Word of God is sort of the thing in dispute and the thing that we need to affirm, and that Better Pairs kind of operates as sort of like this seed crystal. That if we have an insight, that we have something, in this, our conversation today, and spark something in the audience that they haven't really thought about before. The faith or the God part of it, right, is that the God of reason, the God who creates you, right, creates me, creates the members of our audience, can kind of weave those truths independently, right? That kind of we get that spark and that fire can fan itself. It's something we have to deal with when we have students, right? You have students for a semester, you have students for 4 years in a college program, but the idea is how do I influence this person? How do I present dispose matter in the correct way,
Yeah.
like a gardener,
Yes.
to help cultivate this person into a lifelong learner, right? And
Yeah.
by lifelong learner, not just sort of the whatever 80, 90, 100 years or whatever they might be alive in this life, but lifelong learners into eternal life, right? That this
Mm-hmm.
becomes this desire, this hunger for truth, this hunger for kind of the dad jokes of the created order becomes a part of them, becomes something that they yearn for, that when they do the work to earn their daily bread, that it is always in a desire to see that in the context of this growing in wisdom, growing in God's truth and His goodness and His beauty. So that's
Yes.
it's an exciting project, and I do think um, that that again, that compartmentalization, right? Here's my work. Okay, Dr. Ramage, I'm going to be a petroleum engineer. So
Yeah.
why am I taking a theology class, right? Um, no, but you're going to be a petroleum engineer who's a human being, who
Yes.
who is going to maybe pull out the richness of rock oil for a couple decades, but
Mm-hmm.
but but you have an everlasting existence, and so I always joke, sometimes we'll talk about a 5-year plan. What's your 5,000-year plan? Where do you
Yeah.
see yourself in 5,000 years? And it kind of just, I've had students who just mind blown, right? It's just like, well, I'll be dust. I'm like, but are you really going to be dust, right? Is that
Yeah.
is that is that is that the truth of things? Is it just matter, or is there something more than matter?
Yes. I'm reminded of a C.S. Lewis line from his book, The Great Divorce, which is not about divorce, it's about heaven, hell, and purgatory, where he's talking about how No. I got the wrong book, Jason. It's in The Weight of Glory by
Ah, yeah.
Lewis, where he says that next to the Blessed Sacrament, the holiest object that presents itself to your senses is your neighbor. And so you daily carry that weight of glory of your neighbor, that if you understood what that person was called to, that you would be tempted to worship them, essentially. And on the other hand, if they are hellbound, then they're worse than your worst nightmare. But this the idea that right now it may seem like we're in a secular, dissociated from God atmosphere. I'm in my office here, but I'm going to go out there and probably hear people in the hallway chit chatting about all kinds of banal things, but that person is called to this deep communion with God, and ultimately, hopefully, with me in heaven. And that should change the way I live right now, and not wait until there's a apparently more holy moment to do that.
Yeah, no, I wonder if Lewis is sort of, I have my dad joke about neighbors as sort of this boring person who is nigh. But I think bore in that sense might have something to do about this sort of bearing, right, of carrying this person near you,
Yeah.
kind of related to this idea of sort of uh, vicinity and and being kind of close and yet somehow in a kind of social or allegiance with one another towards some common goal, which is
Hmm.
which is something that's difficult these days, right? Having neighbors, having community is a struggle. Something that Better Pairs is here to help with, right? Here to help
Yes.
um, foster this sort of community of ideas, but also the community of purpose of understanding this common good that is held together in common and needs to be protected and enjoyed. So we did not get to Genesis 3. So hey, there's no fall. No, okay, there is a fall. If anybody's worried about that, but it has been great speaking with you today. I do have uh, some time here at the end just to give you a chance to share your current project, what you're working on with our audience, and to let them know how they can follow your work.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I wrote a 300-page book on this subject that does go into the fall as
Oh,
well.
good.
Uh, Came out in 2022, called From the Dust to the Earth, Benedict XVI, the Bible, and the Theory of Evolution. I've had so many questions from students, people disturbed in their faith over the years, thinking that they had to leave their faith because evolution's true, or they feel like they have to reject pretty well established science because some guy on the internet told them you had to believe the world's 6,000 years old and things like that. So it's really the both and of Catholicism. And there are lots of people you could go to. Aquinas, lots of good Thomists are working on applying his principles. But I went with Pope Benedict because he was the most prolific, arguably greatest theologian of the past century. He had the biggest hand of shaping the church for the good, and under John Paul II for decades, and then as Pope for a decade, and all these things. And the guy really cared about the subject of creation and
Mm,
science and dialogue. So that's one. But currently, the big thing I've been doing is I've been working on a book on Catholicism, on stewardship of creation. I co-direct a Center for Integral Ecology at Benedictine College, where I teach full time. And so the idea is to have a real Catholic, Orthodox, well-grounded approach to care for creation that doesn't fall into the pitfalls of anti-humanism that you so often see in the environmental movement.
true.
And then, so on the one hand, you have Catholics like me who are pro-life, like you. I know you're deeply committed to the unborn and everything. So, but the problem is a lot of times Catholics of this persuasion think that the environment's for the other side, but
Mm,
it's really a both and then the environmentalists are oftentimes deeply at odds with church teaching about life and its respect from conception to natural death. So if people want to follow a little bit what I'm doing, I do a monthly column for Catholic World Report, and I call it God's Two Books, going into themes of creation and scripture. And what else? Then they can go to my website. I always just post a podcast. I'll put this on here eventually. Post articles I write. It's just Matthew Ramage, like damage with an R.com.
wonderful. Yes, and we'll put the links in the description below this video. So thank you again, Matthew, from all of us here at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire. Thank you for watching. See you next time on the Confederal Reserve. Bye now.